our limud of Sefer Yirmiyahu Hanavi. We are, Baruch Hashem, going to finish today, and we're doing Perek Nun Beis, which is the last Perek, the end of Perek Nun Aleph, which was a very, very long nevuah about the eventual downfall of Bavel that was given to Yirmiyahu before the Churban. And as I indicated, I don't have a complete yishuv why there needed to be such an arichus. But that was the end of the book. The end of Perek Nun Aleph says, Ad Hena Divrei Yirmiyahu. So Perek Nun Beis, the last chapter of the book, is really a historical appendix which repeats to some degree the book of Malachim, the end of Malachim, although this may have been written first, and the end of Divrei Hayamim, that describe the actual Chorban Beis HaMikdash, that in the book of Yirmiyahu is nowhere described until this point. And Perek Nun Beis, this is really going to be just the history of the time, the final history. Of course, keep in mind that Yirmiyahu gave you post-Chorban history with Gedaliah and Gedaliah's assassination, and we had a lot of arichos. And he did discuss Nebuchadnezzar breaking through the city and conquering it and destroying the city. But for reasons that are a bit elusive, Yirmiyahu Hanavi did not give us a description of the Chorban Beis HaMikdash itself. And insofar as this book is concerned, we only know it from the very last Perek that we're going to learn now. So Perek Nun Beis, Pasuk Aleph, starts off with the reign of Tzidkiyahu. Ben Esrim v'achas shana Tzidkiyahu b'malchai. Tzidkiyahu was 21 years old when he became king. Achas esrei shana malach v'Yushalayim. He was a king for 11 years. V'shem imo Chamutal bas Yirmiyahu milivna. His father was the very, very righteous king, Yoshio HaMelech, that we know from before. His mother was Chamutal, the daughter of Yirmiyahu from the city of Livna. This is not our Yirmiyahu, this is another Yirmiyahu with the same name. What type of king was Tzidkiyahu? So the pasuk says, Vayas hara b'yeinei Hashem. He did evil in the eyes of God, as his nephew Yehoiakim. Because again, let me remind you that Yoshio HaMelech was a very, very righteous man. Yoshio had a son. Yehoiakim was his brother. Yoshio had a son Yehoachaz, who was king for 3 months, and then another son Yehoiakim, who was king for 11 years. Then Yehoiakim had a son, Yehoiachin, who was only king for 3 months. And Tzidkiyahu is Yehoiachin's uncle, who is Yehoiakim's brother. Now here it says, Tzidkiyahu was a Rasha. In point of fact, Chazal do not understand the narrative that way. They actually say Tzidkiyahu was a great tzaddik. But he committed a sin in rebelling against Bavel when Yirmiyahu told him not to, and Yirmiyahu even entertained the possibility that had Tzidkiyahu not rebelled and would be content to remain under Bavel, perhaps the Beis HaMikdash would not have been destroyed and there wouldn't have been a galus. L'maisa, that's a little shver, actually more than a little shver, because if the Chorban occurred because of Avodah Zarah, Gilarai, Shvichus Damim, how could that have been averted if we simply remained peaceful with Bavel? That was a question I raised, something that we still need to think about. But when it says he did bad in the eyes of God, it does not mean he was a Rasha generally, but it means primarily in rebelling against Bavel. And that's what the next pasuk says. Ki, Alaf Hashem Haisa B'Yerushalayim V'Yehuda Adashlichu Osam B'Al Panav. Because of his Averis, it was God's anger against Yerushalayim and Yehuda to throw them away. because Vayimraid Sidkiyahu the Melech Bavel. Because Sidkiyahu rebelled against the king of Babel. Now the Gemara in Nedarim has a whole Maisa here that's not in the Pasuk itself, that originally Sidkiyahu was a faithful vassal, king, servant of Nebuchadnezzar, but he once encountered Nebuchadnezzar eating a raw rabbit, a live rabbit, very repulsive, very meistic. Nebuchadnezzar made Sidkiyahu swear that he would never reveal this upon pain of death. Sidkiyahu did reveal it, Mavaza the king, and that's why it doesn't say he rebelled against Bavel, but he rebelled against Melech Bavel. In fact, even the name Sidkiyahu was the name Nebuchadnezzar gave him. His original name was Matanya. Sidkiyahu is Ka Yatstik Alecha Esadin Im Timraid Bi. If you rebel against me, God will justify whatever suffering happens to you. So, be it as it may, Nebuchadnezzar now besieges Yerushalayim, and now we're going to see the story. Vehi Bashana Hatashiyas L'Malchai. In the 9th year of Sidkiyahu's reign, B'Chodesh Asiri, in the 10th month, which is Teves, V'Asor LaChodesh, the 10th of Teves, Ba Nebuchadrezzar Melech Bavel Hu V'Chol Cheloi Al Yerushalayim, V'Yachanu Aleha, V'Yivnu Aleha Dayek Saviv. So this is why, to this very day, we fast on the 10th of Teves, because the 10th of Teves was when Nebuchadnezzar began his siege against Yerushalayim. And he built a dayek. A dayek is simply like a raised platform. When you want to enter a city with a wall, you build a platform and then your army can climb over the wall. And he built it. And because there's a siege, no food could enter the city, so the city was in a great famine. Vatavai ho'ir b'matzar, the city was in a state of famine and siege, ad ashtei esrei shana l'melch, until the 11th year. Right, so it's 2 years of siege, more than 2 years. B'chodesh haravi, in the 4th month, that is Tammuz, Batisha lachodesh, the 9th of Tammuz, Vayechazak harav ba'ir, the famine in the city was very extreme. V'lo hayo lahem lechem liyama aretz, there was really almost no bread in the city. Vatibaka ha'ir, the Babylonians finally succeeded in breaking through the walls of the city on the 9th of Tammuz. Now, the Gemara in Tainus explains that in the Mikdash Sheni, the Romans broke through the city on the 17th of Tammuz. The Mikdash Rishon was the 9th of Tammuz, so logically, the 9th of Tammuz should have been a Tainus. But Memela, if you have to choose between the 9th and the 17th, so you go with the Mikdash Sheni because that was the perennius that's most vivid to us, because that's the one that is closest to our experience. So in the Mikdash Rishon, Hufka Ha'ir, we're actually not given a date for when the Romans began the siege against Jerusalem. That's very interesting. So we don't have an Asara B'Teves analog for the Mikdash Sheni, but the Hufka Ha'ir by the Mikdash Rishon was the 9th of Tammuz, and the Hufka Ha'ir by the Mikdash Sheni was the 17th of Tammuz. But Tibaka Ha'ir, the city was broken into, V'chol Anshe HaMilchama Yivrechu, and the soldiers fled the city, the Jewish soldiers. Vayetzu mi'er laila derech shar bein achomosayim asher al gan hamelech v'kastem al ir savav yelchu derech arava. So this refers specifically to Tzidkiyahu and his family and his private army, his private soldiers. They tried to escape the city at night through the gate. Now again, Chazal explained that this was actually a subterranean tunnel that to this very day is known as Ma'aras Tzidkiyahu, running under the old city. And it comes out on the plains that are adjacent to Yericho. And Tzidkiyahu was trying to escape, and he would have escaped. But Hashem made a miracle of sending a deer that Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers were chasing. And they were riding all the way to the Arvas Yericho, and Punkt, when Tzidkiyahu came out, they arrived at Arvas Yericho. And Tzidkiyahu was apprehended. Now, that's not what the pasuk itself says. The pasuk just says, pasuk Ches, Vayirdefu chelkas t'machrei hamelech, that they were pursuing the king, v'yasigu es Tzidkiyahu b'arvas Yericho, they apprehended him by the plains of Yericho, v'chol cheiloi nefatzim lev, and all of his protective secret service, they just scattered. Vayitfasu es hamelech, they took Tzidkiyahu, v'yalu also el melech Bavel Rivlasa, they brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, who was in Rivla. Rivla is not Bavel, Rivla is in Syria. B'yeretz Chamas, v'yidaber itai mishpatim, and they proclaimed harsh judgments against him. Now again, Tzidkiyahu was not killed. He was taken to Bavel, but he was blinded. Vayishchat melech Bavel es b'nei Tzidkiyahu li'einav, the king of Bavel slaughtered all of Tzidkiyahu's children in front of his eyes. V'gam es kol Sari Yehuda shachat b'Rivlasa, and he also slaughtered many of the nobility of Yehuda. V'yes einei Tzidkiyahu iver, and then he blinded Tzidkiyahu. V'yasreyu b'nechushtayim, and he put him in copper chains. V'yeveu melech Bavel, and he was brought to Bavel. V'yitneu bebeis hapakudais ad yomaisai, and he remained in prison till the day of his death. We're actually told that he died either the same day or the day after Nebuchadnezzar. Now this is in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar reigned 45 years, so Tzidkiyahu lived many, many years in prison, but he did die naturally, and this was a promise yirmiyahu made to him, b'nevuah, when Nebuchadnezzar died. And again, this was a fulfillment of a prophecy to Tzidkiyahu that if he rebels against Bavel, he will be brought to Bavel, he will die in Bavel, but his eyes will never see Bavel, and he didn't understand what that means, but now we see it was Mekuyim. He was blinded in Rivla and brought to Bavel as a blind man. That is the death of Tzidkiyahu. Pasuk Yud Beis. Ubachodesh hachamishi, the 5th month, counting from Nisan, which is the month of Av. So this would be 1 month after the city was broken into, because the city was broken into on the 9th, and the Chorban will be the 9th, the 10th, we'll see that in a moment, as opposed to 3 weeks between Shivas Arba Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. Pasuk Yud Beis, Ubachodesh hachamishi, it was the 5th month, B'Esor Lachodesh, the 10th of the month. I'll come back to this in a moment. Shinas Tisha Esrei Shana LeMelech Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. Actually, I misspoke. This is the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Ba Nevuzaradin Rava Tabochim Amad Lefnei Melech Bavel. Nevuzaradin, who is the chief butcher, that is kind of the derogatory term that is always used for Nebuchadnezzar's general. He came to Yerushalayim. Nebuchadnezzar was not there. Vayisreif. Again, we read these psukim. We're reading about the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Vayisreif es Beis Hashem, v'es Beis HaMelech. He burns the house of God, as well the Beis HaMikdash, as well as the house of the king. But the Yerushalayim is called Beis HaGadol Saraf B'Yesh. All the luxurious houses are burnt B'Yesh. V'yesh kol chaimes Yerushalayim Saviv, and the walls, Natasu kol chel kastim, the armies of the kastim, destroyed the walls. Asher Esrav Tabachim, all of the armies of the costume that were together with Nebuzaradan. Now here it does say the 10th of Av. So the Gemara explains that in fact the Beis HaMikdash was set on fire on the 9th of Av in the late afternoon, and most of the Mikdash was Necharav on the 10th, Ad Kedei Kach, that Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai says, if he would have been alive at the time of the Churban, he would have made the fast on the 10th of Av, rather than the 9th of Av. We make it on the 9th of Av because we say, Aschalta de Paranusa Adifa, the beginning of a Paranius is most gripping, is most heartbreaking. Once it starts, you get used to it on some level. But that initial shock is the most devastating. So that's why it says that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed on the 10th, even though the Sreifa began the late afternoon of the 9th. Pasuk Tesvav, Umidalos ha'am v'yes yeser ha'am hanisharim be'ir v'yes ha'neiflim asher noflu el melech Bavel v'yes yeser ha'amain, and the remaining people who were not yet killed, they were just in the city, Nebuzaradan sent them to Bavel. They went into Golus. However, as we read earlier, Midalos ha'aretz, he shared Nebuzaradan Rav Tabachim lekormim uliyagvim, that there were people who were so impoverished, they had no resources, that Nebuzaradan left a small remnant of Jews in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yehuda to tend the vineyards and the wine presses. This is called Dalas Aretz, and if you remember, they were under the governorship of Gedaliah ben Achikam, and when Gedaliah ben Achikam was killed, this small group fled to Mitzrayim, where eventually Mitzrayim was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar after the Churban, and many of them wound up dying. But at least initially, they were given the ability to remain in Eretz Yisrael. So now we have a brief description of some of the items of the Beis HaMikdash that were destroyed. And to fully understand this, you really have to go back to the book of Malachim. V'yes amudei hanacheshes asher lebeis Hashem. If you remember the Ulam, which was the big hallway before the Beis HaMikdash, inside the Ulam by the Heichal, outside of the Heichal, you had huge copper columns that are called Yachin Ubayaz. Yachin, God prepares for his people. Bayaz, in God there is strength. These are huge copper, beautiful amudim. So the amudei nechayches that were outside of the Heichal, inside of the Ulam, Mechonos were very complicated wagons on wheels that carried portable kiyorot that the Kohanim would wash their hands. Es hayam, yam was a huge mikvah-size tub of water that was supported by statues of 12 bakor, and that's called the Yam Shel Shlomo, and that functioned both as a mikvah, mamash a mikvah, and it functioned as a source of water for the kiyoros to wash their hands and feet. So the amudei nechayches, the mechonos, the wagons, the yam hanechoshes, these are first the copper items. Asher beveis Hashem, shibru kastim beyisu is called nechushtim bavela. The kastim smashed them up and brought the copper to Bavel. Vesasirais, vesayoyim, vesamazamrais, vesamizrakais, vesakapais, veskol klei anacheshes, asher yishasabam lakachu. All sorts of copper utensils, the bowls, shovels, musical instruments, basins, spoons, all of the klei nechayshis were taken. And then it goes about gold. V'esasipim, v'esamachtes, v'esigas, v'esasiros, v'esamenayros, v'esakapas, v'emenakios, asher zav, zav, asher kesef, kesef, lokach ravet habachim. Similar, the bowls, the basins, the pots, the menorahs, because there was more than one menorah. Remember the book of Malachim in the Mikdash Rishon, Shlomo HaMelech made 10 menorahs in addition to the menorah of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that which was gold, that which silver, silver. Nevuzaradin plundered. The Beis HaMikdash was plundered. Copper, silver, gold. For reasons I'm not sure, it actually gives more detail about the copper than the other things, which is really interesting. We would have thought the gold and the silver would be more valuable. Now it goes back and describes the two amudim outside of the Heichal, the Yachin and the Bayaz. Ha'amudim shenayim hayam echad. The amudim, there were two amudim. The Yam Shel Shlomo was one. Habakor, under the Yam Shel Shlomo, there were 12 statues of cattle in copper that were supporting it. Shnei Masar Nechayshas. Asher Tachas HaMachainis. Very difficult. Here it says the Bakor were under the Machainis. This is very, very schwer. The Bakor were not under the wagons. The Bakor were under the Yam Shel Shlomo. So you have to say that the words Asher Tachas HaMachonos, Machonos here includes the Yam Shel Shlomo, but the truth is Rashi himself says it's very, very schwer. Rashi blibes by a kasha. Now I'm just thinking out loud. There actually is a Talmud Yerushalmi that says that even for the first Mikdash, it was Hufka Ha'ir on the 17th of Tammuz. The pasuk says the 9th of Tammuz. So the Yerushalmi says an amazing thing, unlike the Bavali that says Kan b'mikdash Rishon, Kan b'mikdash Sheni. The Yerushalmi has a different mahalach. The Yerushalmi says Kilkol Cheshbonais Ikakan. That yirmiyahu is so overwhelmed with grief that in his confusion he doesn't have his dates right. Alibid the Emes, that could even be a teretz for why it says the 10th of Av, although we have a different teretz for that. So I'm trying to think, maybe, but Derech Efshar, I didn't see this anywhere. Once you're describing a person who is so overwhelmed with grief that there's a kilkel of the cheshbainis, then maybe the same thing when you're describing something and you're all famattered and you're confused and you're mavulbul. So you'll talk about the behemoths, the bakar under the machainis when you really meant under the Am. Maybe there's a deliberate confusion here because it's describing the confusion and the turmoil that Yidden were going through. That could be Efshar b'derech Efshar mamish. So that's the Amudim and the Bakor and the Machainis. And it says, Lo haya mishkal and chushastam kol hakem laya. There was so much nechayshas that I can't even give you a weight. And now we go back to the Amudim, which are described in great detail in the book of Malachim, and in a little bit of detail here as well. Pasuk Chaf Aleph, V'amudim shmein esrei ama kaimas amud echad. One amud was 18 amos high. V'chut shteim esrei ama yisubenu. And you could encircle it. The circumference was 12 amos. The avyai arba etzba'is navuv. And its thickness would be 4 navuv. So first of all, it says it was hollow inside. So this was actually a hollow amud. But the thickness of the copper until you were hollow was 4 fingers. So it was 18 amos high, circumference of 12 amos, but it was only thick 4 fingers, and the rest of it was hollow. V'kaiseres alav nechayshas. And on top of the Amud was a crown of Nechashas. V'kaimas ha'kaiseres ha'achas chomesh amos. The kaiseres, on top of the 18 amos, was another 5 amos of a kaiseres. I think they call it a capital in architectural terms. Chomesh amos. Usvacha. And over the kaiseres was a netting, a copper netting. V'rimainim ala kaiseres saviv. And there were pomegranates on top of the kaiseres. Hakol nechashas. Uche'ele li'amud hasheni v'rimainim. And similarly, the other column also had the kaiseres and the remainim, kind of copper pomegranates. These are all copper. Now, Pasuk Chaf Gimel then says, Vayiyu harimainim tishim v'shisha rucha. The remainim on top of the kaiseres were 96. And then it says, Kol remainim meya ala svacha saviv. That the remainim were 100 on top of the netting. So you obviously have a stira right away, 96 or 100. And the emesis as well, that it actually mentions that you had two, in the book of Malachim, there's Bechlal stira. In the book of Malachim, it mentions that there were 2 rows of remainim on each column, right? So you have the amud, you have the kaiseres, you have a svacha, a netting over the kaiseres. On top you have remainim, 2 rows of remainim. Each row of remainim is 100. 100 remainim on top of 100 remainim. And for the 2 columns, that's a total of 400 remainim. So when it says 100, it simply means 1 row was 100, right on top of the keser. I shouldn't say 1 row, because actually you had several rows, but 1 layer of remainim was 100, and on top of that was another 100. So 100 means the lower group. Why do you get 96? So Rashi says, Pashut, that the way it worked was that since the amudim were flush against the wall, then 4 remainim for each section, that would mean 8. 8 per amud and 8 for the other amud. But for 100, 4 of them were covered up by the wall. So visibly, you could only see 96. Okay. So this describes the plundering of the Beis HaMikdash. And then Pasuk Chavdalet says, Vayikach Ravat Habachim es Suraya Kayin Haraish, V'es Sefanya Kayin HaMishnah, V'es Shaleshes Shemrei Hasof. He took the Kayin Gadol, whose name was Suraya, and Sefanya, not the Navi, a different one, was the Sagan, the assistant Kayin Gadol, and the 3 primary caretakers of the gates of the Beis HaMikdash. Umin Ha'ir, and similarly from the city generally, Lokach Saris Echad Asher Haya Pakid Al Anshe Milchama, he took a general who was in charge of the soldiers. V'shiva Anashim Rei Pnei HaMelech, he took 7 of the king's closest advisors, Asher Nimtzu Be'ir, V'yas Sefer Tzaratzava Matzvi Yisam Haaretz, and he took the scribe, he was like the secretary who kept military records. V'shishimish, he just took 60 leaders, Meyama Aretz and Nimtzam B'toch Ha'ir. Vayikach Eisam Nevuzarad Rav Zabach V'yelach Eisam HaMelech Bavu Rav Lasa, he brought them, this is besides Tzidkiyahu, he brought them to Nebuchadnezzar. No particular reason, just to kill some of the prominent Jews. Vayaka Eisam Melech Bavel V'yimisem Berivla Be'eretz Chamas. Nebuchadnezzar killed them, perhaps personally even. And overall, what happened was, Vayagel Yehuda Me'al Admaso. Yehuda was exiled from its land. And Pasuk Chavches, Zeh ha'am asher hegel Nebuchadnezzar. And these are the people that Nebuchadnezzar exiled. Bishnas Sheva, in the 7th year of his reign. Now this goes all the way back to the Golus of Yehoiachin. This is 11 years before the Churban. There was the first wave of exiles, which are called the Charash and the Maskir, which literally means the carpenters and the locksmiths, but Chazal understand this to mean the Talmidei Chachamim. Mordechai was in that exile. Yecheskel Hanavi was in that exile. And the purpose was to prepare a Makom Torah for Am Yisrael, so that when the rest of the Galus goes, they will already have a Makom Torah there. So the first Galus is 11 years before the Churban, in the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and the number of the exiles that comprise the Choresh and the Maskir are 3,023. Now, Rashi actually points out that in the book of Malachim we actually have more than 10,000, and he explains 3,023 from Yehuda. But Yirmiyahu had already brought back, it's going like that, Mandi Amar, all of the 10 tribes. So the other 7,000 were from the Aseres HaShvatim. So actually, you have to augment this 3,000 with another 7,000. Now that was in the 7th year. Pasuk Chavtes, Bishnas Shemaina Esra Nebuchadnezzar, in the 18th year, which is 11 years later, and that's called the Galus of Tzidkiyahu. Now, again, a little contradiction. Here it says it happened in the 18th. We had just read it was in the 19th year. So the Gemara in Megillah explains that it was the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but he did not conquer Eretz Yisrael until the 2nd year of his reign. So as a result, the Galus of Yechaniah happened the 8th year of his reign, which was the 7th year of his conquest of Eretz Yisrael. The Galus of Tzidkiyahu happened in the 19th year of his reign, which was the 18th year of his conquest of Eretz Yisrael. Either way, it was 11 years later. Now here, the number we're given is quite amazing, because we look at, this is the Galus of the Churban. The Galus of the Churban, and all it says is, Shemaina Meyais Shaloshim Mushnayim. 832 people. Now, that's kind of schwer. That's the Galus. The Galus is only 832 people. The answer is, okay, a certain number was left, that's called the Dalas Haaretz, but they must have been less than that. The assumption is they were a minority of the minority. The short answer is, this tells you how many people were killed. The vast majority were simply murdered. They died. And the Galus, it says here, is only 832 people, unless, Rashi doesn't say, unless you also add the Aseres HaShvatim to this. I mean, the same way that you went from 3,000 to 10,000 by adding the Aseres HaShvatim, maybe there would be a similar adjustment here, but on the other hand, we don't have any record of that. So it's a bit of a tzarachian, unless you assume that everybody was killed. Now, so the Galus of the 7th year is the Galus of Yehoiachin. The Galus of the 18th year is the Galus and Churban of Tzidkiyahu. But then there's a third Galus that's mentioned. Bishnas Shalosh V'Yesrim L'Nebuchadnezzar. The 23rd year, this is after the Churban. Hegla Nebuzaradin Ravat Tabachim Yehudim Nefesh Sheva Meos Arboim B'Chamisha. 745. What Galus is this? There are no Jews in Yerushalayim anymore. I mean, Gedaliah was killed. They dispersed to Mitzrayim. So here the Meforshim say that this is an unrecorded Galus. At the time of the Churban, there were many Jews who tried to escape. They went to Amain. They went to Mayav. They went to Edom. They went to other countries. After Gedaliah was killed, they went to Mitzrayim, which had not yet been conquered by Babylon. Basically, by the 23rd year, this is post-Churban, all of the places where the Yidden went to for refuge were conquered. And Yidden were exiled. There is an exile that is post-Churban Beis HaMikdash. Now, I assume they were exiled along with the local inhabitants of those countries. So altogether, the total number that you add up is 4,600, but again, you have to add another 7,000 for the Aseret Hashvatim. So not as many people went into Golus as you sometimes think, but again, that's not a good sign. That's because so many, in fact, died. Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Now, keep in mind that there was a king before Tzidkiyahu, his nephew, Yehoiakim's son, who only ruled for 3 months, and then he was deposed, and he was taken to Bavel to be imprisoned, and that was the Golus of the Choresh and the Masker, called the Golus of Yehoiachin, or Golus Yechanya, or Golus Kinayahu. They're all the variations of the name. Yehoiachin has been languishing in prison all of these years. And now we are told, Vayihi, Bishleishim v'sheva shana, Legolus Yehoiachin melech Yehuda. The 37th year of his exile. Now remember, his exile is 11 years before the Churban. So this is 26 years after the Churban. Nebuchadnezzar has died, and Tzidkiyahu died as well, but Nebuchadnezzar is succeeded by his son, Avil Merudach. The 37th year of Galus Yehoiachin, 26 years after the Churban, Bishneim Asar Chaydesh, the 12th month, which is Adar, Esrim v'chamisha l'Chaydesh, the 25th of Adar, Nasa Evil Merudach Melech Bavel B'shnas Malchusay. When Evil Merudach becomes king, he releases Yehoiachin, who had been in prison for 37 years, Melech Yehuda. Vayaytzi Aisai mi Beis HaKala. He takes him out of prison. Vayedaber Itai Tayvais. He treats him good. Vayitenes Kisem Imal L'Kisei Malachem. He elevates his seat above other kings, Asher Itai Bavavel. Veshinas Bigdei Killa. He changed his prison garments. V'yachal lechem lefanav tamid kol yemei chayav. And the rest of Yehoiachin's life, after 37 years of prison, he eats with the king. V'yaruchasai aruchas tamid nitnu le'meis melech Bavel dvar yom b'yamo. He was given his daily meal ad yom meisai, until the day that he died. Kol yemei chayav. Let me point out that Malchus Beis David, Mashiach, comes from Yoshiyahu, meaning to say Tzidkiyahu was wiped out, meaning there is no Zera of Malucha. Again, there are many descendants of David HaMelech, because not all of them became kings, but of the Zera of kings, Yoshiyahu is the last survivor of Malchus Beis David, and from him will come the Mashiach. And therefore there's a remes here of Evil Merudach taking Yehoiachin out of the Beis HaAsurim, that there will come a time that even the Ummos HaElam are going to be Mamlich Mashiach ben David as their king. May we be Zeicha to see this Bimheira v'yameinu. So, Baruch Hashem, we were Messiah, although it's a very sad parak in many ways. We were Messiah, the long and difficult book of Sefer yirmiyahu. But even this book ends on the positive note of Yehoiachin being taken out of prison and being elevated. You remember I said before that the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva uses Yehoiachin as an example of tshuva. He returned to Hashem, although he had been a Rasha, he returned to Hashem b'chol levav b'chol nafshay, and because of this he merited to be the makor of the Bias HaMashiach. Ken Yehi Ratzon.